Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here, and I want it to be a dialogue, so feel free to interject at any time. My name is Karen Garst. I have had a very eclectic career. I went to Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, which is a Lutheran-affiliated college, got a degree in French, decided to get a master's, went to the University of Wisconsin, got a master's in French, decided I really didn't like that, got a PhD in education, and it was the 70s in Madison, Wisconsin, so it was quite good. And there were very few jobs in academia, so I decided to do something else and became a labor organizer for the American Federation of Teachers, which took me to Portland in 1980. I did that, and then I became the executive director of the Oregon Community College Association, did a lot of lobbying in Salem. Don't miss that. And then finally, the last 13 years of my career, I was executive director of the Oregon State Bar. I retired in 2008 to my 5 acres with my husband and a dog and several cats, and now we have chickens as well. And I spent about 4 or 5 years working on my genealogy. Very interesting. You should probably be retired before you try it, though, because if you get on Ancestry.com, it's a black hole. But I traced my ancestors back to 1635, found out I was related to a patriot, joined the Daughters of the American Revolution. And then last summer I had lunch with a friend of mine, Kate Dyer Seeley, who writes mystery novels. And I've known her for quite a while. And she told me, Karen, you should write a book. I said, write a book? Well, I think the only thing I could get excited about was atheism. And the reason I said that was because in July of 2014, the United States Supreme Court, in a decision Burwell versus Hobby Lobby Stores, Inc., said that a corporation, which they had previously decided was a person, that the person could now have religious beliefs. And because Hobby Lobby, a person, had religious beliefs, they did not need to provide certain forms of birth control through the Affordable Care Act to their women employees. And that got my dander up. I'm 64. I lived through the 60s and 70s. I protested. I fought for women's rights, fought for the access to abortion, birth control, and here we go again. We're going backwards. When women won the right to vote, we didn't keep arguing about that. We got it, and we have it, and nobody's suggesting taking it away. Yet on these other issues, it seems that there is a continual fight. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the Supreme Court decision was written by 5 Catholic men. So I started out by reading pretty much everything in the Tualatin Library about religion. I was deciding what did I want to do, and I had read quite a bit prior. And then I decided that I would compose a book of essays of people's personal journeys. And I started out with men and women. Then it got to the point where it was a little too eclectic, so I decided to focus just on women. So I had to say bye to the guys. And Bernie was very helpful in helping me rebuild my slate, if you will. And it's been a very, very interesting process. While most of these people, these women, live in Portland or around Portland, they've come from a variety of states. I have one person who was born in England, 2 who were born in Germany. So Oregon is kind of its own melting pot, and so we have a diverse view. People grew up in Texas, I grew up in North Dakota, etc. And each of those people is writing about how they came to be non-religious, whether they call themselves agnostic, atheist, spiritual, but they no longer believe in organized religion. Each of these essays is about 5,000 words. We are now at the process of giving them to an editor that I've hired, because most of these women aren't professional writers. And so the editor's going to go over and give it a once through. And then this summer I'm going to be prepared to shop the book I'm open to all possibilities, whether it's finding an agent or working directly with publishing houses. If I'm not successful in that, I will self-publish it. As you are probably aware, most of the new atheists are men. There is a phrase called the Four Horsemen, which consists of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and the late Christopher Hitchens. And a lot of the debates, if you go on YouTube, are men. I don't know if it's because women are reluctant to debate or there's fewer of them involved, but I think there's a real niche here to hear from women about their personal experiences, which are going to be different from men, obviously. I've also written an article about the subjugation of women in the Bible and early Christianity, which will be in an appendix. And then another area that I've been pursuing is how the feminine got eliminated from the divine. I talked a little bit the last time I was here about the images of a female deity, a female goddess, and how that image and that persona, if you will, gradually got erased with monotheism and through Christianity. And that may be an additional part of the appendix as well. Personally, I was raised as a Lutheran in Bismarck, North Dakota, so I fit in very well. Everyone I knew went to church. I could tell you the denomination that everyone went to. There were probably 4 or 5 Jewish families. They had a little synagogue. And I decided that I wanted to go to this Lutheran college. And when I went, I was surprised in my first Religion 101 class that they talked about the oral strains of the Old Testament. And they talked about the various writers, J for Yahweh, E for Elohim, D for the Deuteronomist, and P for Priestley. And wow, I guess I thought it was written by Moses. It really opened me to a more historical view and a literary view of the Bible, which I have pursued since then. And the college was very open. I did a report when I was a sophomore in my religious class about homosexuals, read a book called Gay World, and said, "Oh, I don't see any problem with that." And that was my first exposure. So it was a pretty liberal, I think, at that time in the 70s to have those kind of topics. Most of my friends know that I'm an atheist. I've probably been an atheist for 2 decades. Not 20, no, 20 years, 2 decades, yes. I just gradually moved away from the church. To me, church was family. It was my only social life in high school. I wouldn't have had any social life without it. And when I became single and working, it just kind of felt weird to go to church alone. I did, however, get married in a church. I had our son christened in a church, and then we finally went to Living Enrichment Center, which, as my mother-in-law said, well, that was a good talk, but I wouldn't call it a sermon. It was a little more like Stephen Covey. And when that church dissolved, we quit going to church about 20 years ago. So let me just open it up for questions you have of that. I have brought some of the essays, and I'm happy to read some of them to maybe entice your interest. So let's just stop for a moment and see if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to add.
I have one. So with indigenous people, there's definitely a Mother Earth, much more inclined in that direction. Are any of your essays by indigenous people?
No, unfortunately. And I had met somebody at one of Bernie's debate who was a former Muslim and gave her my card, but she never got back to me. So that will be another book that somebody else can write. It is interesting, the work they've done with the Iroquois and Hopi in particular were matriarchal societies.
Yes.
It's unclear when you look at the Paleolithic goddesses what they were used for. And I think it would be difficult, although some have felt that some of those Neolithic in particular societies were matriarchy, but without writing, it's more or less conjecture. But as early man came to live in small villages, cities, etc., about 10,000 BC, when they started agriculture, you can see why the female goddess was important. because they revered the woman for giving birth, and to them that was awesome. It was a mystery, and yet it was so important to that tribe to have that child continue. And I'm sure, I was thinking the other day of how amazing it must have been, particularly for women, to understand the cycles of the moon and their own menstrual cycles. Say, what is the relationship between those two things? I mean, you're basically in sync with the moon. And then when agriculture came along, it was very likely the women who were the gatherers who discovered that if they threw the seeds on the ground, they would sprout, and they might be able to do that themselves. It's that same vegetative regenerative process that birth is. So the vegetative, the Mother Earth goddess was obviously female.
Right, yeah, I would absolutely agree. Early agriculture, you're working with the earth and with nature versus modern fertilizer-based where you're fighting it and penetrating it.
Exactly. And they believe that, when you're early in agriculture before the plow, it was probably woman's work. What's interesting, I just finished a book about the grain goddess, which is a type of one of these early goddesses. And there was a story that, and it's interesting that there was a woman escaping a man. So there's always that thread of somebody's going to get me, somebody's going to rape me, somebody's going to violate me. And this was the grain goddess. And she would come to the farmer and say, if somebody comes and follows me, tell them that I came when the seeds were sown. She leaves, and miraculously, the seeds sprout and grow. So the man or the soldiers follow, and they see the plant, and the farmer tells the truth. She came when the seeds were sown. Oh, it's too late, we won't find her then. And that story has continued and continued, and the Virgin Mary gets substituted for that goddess. Jesus gets substituted for the goddess. So you have this folk knowledge and the folk concern about it's important that that crop is bountiful. And this is what I did before, so I'm going to keep trying to do this. And if you want me to say the Virgin Mary instead, okay. So even though the feminine images as a deity and goddess were shut down, particularly by the early church, the people still had that, and it got reworked. You remember the second commandment says, thou shalt not make any images. Well, Pope Gregory in the 4th or 5th century says we're going to have images because people were illiterate. How are we going to teach these stories without drawings? But we, the church, are going to control it. So they started to make paintings and drawings, and often that female presence was the Virgin Mary, who gets elevated through various decrees throughout Christianity and the Catholic tradition that plays a larger and larger role. Other questions, comments? Yes.
So I've read that the statistics show that the percentage of men who are atheists or agnostic or non-believers is significantly higher than the percentage of women. And I was wondering if have you seen that the statistics yourself, and would you have any comments on it?
Well, that's an excellent question. I just read the other day that there's a new survey, and they compared, I believe it's 1993 with 2013, but don't quote me on that. And the percentage of women who identified as none was 16% in 1993, and now it's 43%. There also was an OPB program the other day, I don't know if any of you heard it on the radio, that stated that, and I haven't had a chance to review it, my husband saw it, I listened to it, that Oregon is the least religious state and Portland is the least religious city.
In the U.S.?
In the United States. Statistically, and you ask about countries, so let's take a look at other countries. It's very interesting in terms of women and women's equality that the United States is not the leader. If you look at wage equality, if you look at things like maternity leave, there is a United Nations CEDAW resolution about equal rights for women that we haven't signed, even though 188 of the 190 plus nations of the United nations has signed it. And if you look at those countries that are the leader in wage equity and maternity leave, et cetera, they're the Scandinavian countries who are the least religious. So one might want to draw a conclusion that religion might not be real positive for women. Bernie.
Yeah, are some of the women writing for you, are they all atheists as far as saying they're pretty sure God doesn't exist, or are some of them agnostic saying, I don't know, I could go either way, or
I think there are a few who would be more comfortable with the word agnostic. There are a couple who are undecided and maybe pursuing a spiritual path that's not related to the God of the Bible. But I would say most would be comfortable with agnostic or atheist as a description. So, are you interested in hearing some of these?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Anne, a personal exodus. I remember the morning I woke up and could not believe in God anymore. It was February 2005, and losing my faith was the absolute last thing I ever thought would happen to me. Except maybe being abducted by space aliens. Maybe. I knew there was a God from the time I was a child. Even though I had stopped attending church almost 30 years ago, that belief permeated all of my assumptions about life. It was like the ultimate computer program that ran in the background, assuring me that everything was going to be okay, no matter what happened. In fact, for several months before my sudden loss of faith, I'd been thinking more about God and wondering who he really was. What if I could find out? What if I could connect with him? I decided I would try. But no sooner had I decided this when I got the news in late January of 2005 that my father had passed away unexpectedly. Although we hadn't talked to each other in years, I was still upset, maybe more so because there was a rift between us that I had never been able to mend. I flew out to be with my family. It's hard to describe what happened next. I returned home, settled in, and began to think again about the question of God, except that he was gone. My faith had evaporated. I could not believe there was a God anymore, much less figure out who he was. I was flummoxed, to put it mildly. I depended on my belief for certainty and comfort, and I wanted it back, now. But I couldn't even pray for it to come back. I could not believe. I felt as though someone had picked me up and flung me into the ether, and I was falling with nothing to hold on to. I had no idea how to think about my life or my future. I kept trying to find solid ground, but everything in my frame of reference included God. I began to feel like a wind-up toy that kept going around in a circle and running smack dab into a brick wall. Months went by, and then several years, and I was becoming angry and bitter. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. One day I was browsing through my online movie account, and up popped The God Who Wasn't There. Ha! I thought, there's the title of my life. I'd better check this out. The film is a documentary that questions the existence of Christ, and although I don't remember much of it, I do remember being provoked by what it said. While I doubted some of the beliefs I grew up with, I had never considered actively disbelieving them. And then she goes on and talks about her journey. Marcia. The Church of Christ is a group of loosely affiliated but autonomous congregations with an unofficial motto: speak where the Bible speaks, be silent where the Bible is silent. And if people still had questions the elders couldn't answer with the scripture, they would be told, that is not pertinent to your salvation. I carried my Bible on the school bus, reading, underlining, and memorizing. I carried a little book called Ready Answers to Religious Questions, with indexed reference verses. I was the perfect little Christian soldier. Being baptized at the required age, which turned out to be about 12. My cousins got it wrong again, I thought. And I was always ready to argue religion with my Baptist classmates at school. We exchanged a flurry of themed paper epistles each day, pages filled with dueling Bible verses we'd looked up the night before to prove that our denomination was the right one. I, of course, knew that God had answered my prayer years ago, sending me to the Church of Christ. I had absolute proof. And thus began the life that had been brought about by a convergence of coincidences. Born in a conservative place, at a conservative time in history, and born to conservative parents. Other than outright rebellion, there would have been no way for me to escape this childhood and young adulthood. I was the oldest child and tended toward pleasing the adults who rigidly controlled my life. Pleasing others was my coping survival technique. By being punitive and controlling every aspect of my life, my father very effectively squelched any rebellious thoughts I might have had. He spanked, hit me, for minor infractions like crying, talking back, failure to do chores properly, from the time I was only months old until I graduated from high school. When I was about 8, he punished me for sniffing and rubbing my nose. I had untreated allergies. By painting a circle of mercurochrome on the tip of my nose and making me go to school that way. I went to high school PE classes with bruises on my legs that we would now report to some authorities. He had absolute control. Although I am a very strong-willed person now, my experiences have taught me how easily children can be subjugated and brainwashed into being submissive. My parents had been taught by their culture and religion that the man is the boss. So I was very lucky my authoritarian father did allow us to go to church, or I would never have had a friend. Our family had always kept to itself, and as very young children, my brothers and I weren't even allowed to leave our yard or visit other kids' houses. Everyone had to play in our yard. As a teenager, I wasn't allowed to stay after school for any activities or join any school clubs. Without Sunday school and church, and a very active youth group at that church, my social life would have been non-existent. Uda, growing up atheist.
Hey, Karen, just, can I ask a question?
Yes.
From a psychological point of view, in your work here, have you noticed a difference of psychologically why a woman would leave religion as compared to a male? From, is there something different about the women and the reasons why they're leaving?
I don't know. I would ask the group. I mean, do you think that the people you've talked to, when I did the men, I only got one essay back, and that was clearly science. But I think one of the things, in particular for women in religion, is there's all these father figures. So you're in a family where the man's authoritative, and then you learn that God is a father. The Holy Spirit transformed from female Sophia and wisdom into a male, and Jesus is a male. And our society, even today, is patriarchal. 80% of Congress are men. 5% of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are women. So you get these, what Dawkins called memes, cultural memes, kind of like genes in biology, cultural elements that I think are reinforced more for women than they are for men. So it might be harder to say no because you're saying no to so many things when you leave religion. And sometimes when I've been involved in this project, I hear a little voice in my head saying, "You're doing what?" And it's my father talking to me, who was very religious. And he's passed away, and I would have done it regardless. And we were going to a pretty liberal church when he came to live with us the last 2 years of his life, so he knew where I was going. But you just get these other power and authority figures that are weighing down on you as well. So I think the experience probably is different. I've been out on my 5 acres weeding recently and listening to Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. And I had never read it growing up, but it is amazing. I mean, she talks about the impact Sigmund Freud had, and Sigmund Freud in the United States. And he was raised in a Victorian Austrian culture, and it's very misogynistic. It's very oppressive for women. Almost every theory he comes up with, it's the woman's fault. It's not like the Bible in that regard. And she is talking about the culture in the 50s of women going to college and having a course in marriage, how to be a good wife, etc. And I started college in 1968, and I don't know whether it was the East Coast colleges and I was in the Midwest, but I never felt any of that. But a lot of women who were going to college, drop out, it wasn't cool to be smart, it wasn't cool to go on, your life is to get married, after World War II, get married, have kids, we need increase in population, and they were very frustrated. So a lot of them were going to counselors and psychiatrists, and then what do they encounter there? Philosophies such as those of Sigmund Freud. So I think society, the society we live in, makes it harder. And I also believe it's harder when there aren't models. And that's one of the reasons I want to speak out. Because I'm writing this book so that women who have questions, who are considering leaving religion, can read it and say, oh, she did it, so can I. And I think that's really important. I personally think back to 9th grade, and I had a class on evolution and did a paper on early man, Giganthropus, and Homo erectus, and I was fascinated by it. And I wonder if there had been a teacher who was a woman who said, I did an archaeological dig, I was a paleontologist before, that if I would have had some kind of model, I would have said, I can do that. And my parents would have let me do anything, but it never occurred to me. My mother was a teacher, my sister was a teacher, and I trained to be a teacher. So I think models are important, and I think that's what this will give to women who are questioning their faith. I doubt if many women who are strong evangelical Christians are going to read this book. And that's really not what it's written for. They're happy where they are, they want to be there. This is for women and men who are thinking of leaving their religion.
Okay.
Go back to Bernie's question.
Yes.
You think that, at least I think a lot of it also is that women are under more social pressure to conform to what's considered social norms. In other words, being rebellious and so forth is more considered an admirable trait for men, but less so for women. That it's more frowned upon for women. It's supposed to be more nurturing.
Yeah,
so
and I think
forth.
that's true, and I think the workplace as well. To be able to, to say I'm an atheist and have it be accepted in Oregon, that's not going to be much of a problem, but it's going to be a problem in other places. So I think that's certainly part of it. I also think one of the reasons that there's not more women debating is women just in the 60s and 70s started to explore some of these fields. There weren't religious teachers at universities who were female. I never encountered any when I was at a religious institution. And so they're just starting to get into these fields. So they may be a real minority at the college they teach at, and stepping out and being a new atheist might jeopardize their career. So I think there is certainly more pressure to bear on women there than there are for men.
Just an interesting comment. I think, as you mentioned, as a woman growing up, sometimes it's perceived as not being cool to be educated. You said something like that, right?
That is the premise of Betty Friedan's book at that period in time. It was not cool to be smart.
What period was that?
She wrote it in 1963.
Okay. I was thinking on Facebook there was this article about what an advice columnist wrote 150 years ago, like a Dear Abby kind of thing. And one of the questions in there actually was about something about education and knowledge, and the answer was kind of like, too much education can be dangerous because, it could drive you to insanity. There are some, it was like, it wasn't saying like, it's great to be as educated as possible. It's more like, there are some dangers, and, it was kind of interesting to hear that. I mean, nowadays I don't think anybody says, there's a danger in being too smart, but
it's not cool to be smart. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's what Betty Friedan is saying. It was really, the image was to be cool was to get married. And that's what you were doing at college. It was surprising to me listening to that book, because as I said, when I went to college in 68, at this private school, there were, I don't know what the percentage was, but probably half were women pursuing degrees. And I didn't really feel that feminine mystique about how you have to be feminine. Certainly there were cultural norms about being cute and wearing the right clothes and all of that kind of stuff. But I never heard anyone say anything about you shouldn't be educated, and there were no marriage classes or anything like that. And in my mother's era, my mother was born in 1913. She wanted to be an artist, and her father told her, no, you're going to be a teacher. But she went to school in the 30s and got a 4-year degree and became a teacher. So it must have been an influence of after the war and the focus on building families that this kind of came back and crept back in again, I think. But it was certainly the impetus for the feminist movement.
I would say it's not all anti-feminist too. Like, I remember just a strong anti-intellectual current when I was in school. That it was uncool for anybody to be smart, whether they were male or female.
Interesting.
You mean like
And
you're
what-
called a nerd?
Yes.
Like those are nerds.
Oh.
But it was like, it wasn't in a friendly way like I
Yeah.
think it is these days. It was
Yeah.
it was very dire to be called a nerd.
Yeah.
Well, and certainly in pursuit of things outside the norm, like
Mhm.
science and engineering.
Pointy-headed intellectuals.
Yeah, but that term was a little passé at the time, but it was, the sentiment was still there, definitely.
I think that's still the case. I don't think that's completely gone. And it's probably less gone for females, for
Well,
women.
I have a friend who's 24, who is an engineer at John Deere, and she said she was in a meeting the other day, she was the only woman there. So that is still, I think, particularly in those types of fields, it still is. Now, in terms of law, women did not really get in any sort of numbers until the 70s. And now law school admissions are half and half. And they're tending toward there's going to be more lawyers who are female than male. Engineering's not there yet, who knows? Computer science, those kind of things. Other comments?
Yeah, I have one comment earlier about why do you think there are less atheist women? One of the things that you mentioned child rearing and having families. That means in our society, a lot more women are stay-at-home moms, and where men are in the workplace. Their personality is not defined by their religious beliefs. It's usually by their abilities. Women who are at home raising children often are. There was an example in your reading there where your social network depends on that fabric that you have. So you're interacting at church, daycare. That's your social bonds, and so if you want to reject that, you're also giving away part of your life that you might not be willing to part with.
I think that's an excellent point. The derivation of the word religion is religio, if I'm saying that right. My Latin from 9th grade is escaping me here, but it means to bind together. And so the sense of community is very, very strong. And I certainly know, I never dated in high school, and if I wouldn't have had Luther League, where we met every Sunday and went bowling or roller skating, all of that, I wouldn't have had any social life except playing in band at the games. And I think that's what Marcia says too. You know, that is where her social life was. And so it's difficult. You're giving up friends. Now, one of these authors talks about when they decided to become an atheist. Nobody in their originalist community wanted anything to do with them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want to go out to dinner with them. They didn't want their kids to play with them. And this is not in Oregon. This is somewhere else. But are you going to give up all of that? So those social ties are very important. And there are some faiths where, for example, the Mormon Church does a lot to help people in their community who are in need. If somebody's out of a job, there's a food bank to go to. So are you really willing to give up all of that stuff? The hardest thing for me was music. We used to, in high school youth choir, march down the aisle of the church in robes, singing God's Word is our great heritage. And it was fun. It really, there was something inspiring about that. In fact, when my brother and sister get together every now and again, we'll march around the living room singing the song. So it's deeply ingrained. It's part of who we are. And the other point is ritual. Rituals could have started as early as 50,000 years ago. They've discovered a Neanderthal cave where the skeletons are clearly on purpose. They just didn't fall over. And they've put grave goods in there. Or they've taken a skull and put clay around it and put 2 seashells in for the eyes. They're doing something on purpose. They're trying to understand death. They miss the people who have gone. And they've made some kind of a ritual out of it. Those were the first things we had. So it's, I don't know whether it's genetically part of us or culturally a part of us or conscious part of us, but it is part of us. And so it's difficult to sever. You're severing the ties that bind you.
There is actually another aspect, and that is more probably related to. I mean, I come from Europe, so I'm not native in America, and I think that something that I've seen with Jewish people, and that is very actually part of Serbian heritage. I'm Serbian, so what happened in those cases is that religion is became part of national identity. So it's not. I mean, people there are amazed how how can you be like a Christian and so many different different denominations and that sort of thing. Over there, you're if you're Serbian, you're Orthodox Christian. If you're not Orthodox Christian, you're not Serbian. I mean, that changes now, but that is another hurdle that has to be overcome. And then, on top of that, you can make all these arguments about female being like locked in all that, and all the doors that have to be opened. You have like several more, just because of that, because there is a much deeper connection with tradition that is in danger of being lost if you are not religious.
Well, and you mentioned Jews. When I went to graduate school, I first met, I knew some Jewish people growing up, but Jews who said they were secular and they no longer follow the religion, but they're Jewish.
Right.
So it's all of those things that go into that continue, and to me it's really phenomenal. If you think that the Israelites, however they got into Canaan, whether they were there already, whether they came from the Sinai Desert, where they came out of Egypt, probably not likely, in about 1200 BCE, and what has happened, whether it was the fall of the northern kingdom in 722 BC, they all got carted off, and basically the traces are not to be found from those tribes from the northern kingdom. In 586, the southern kingdom gets conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. They're hauled off to Babylon. They come back. And then in 70 AD, the second temple is destroyed, and they're dispersed in the diaspora. And, of course, World War II and the Holocaust. To think of people holding on to that tradition through all of those things, to me, is phenomenal. It's really phenomenal that people still today identify with that culture from 1200 BCE. Because there's so many cultures and societies that have come and gone in that time.
It seems to have similar experience with the Ottoman Empire, because they had kingdom in the 11th century. Ottomans came in Europe at that time, and the entire Balkans were taken by Ottomans, and they came out at the end of after like the early 20th century, right? But the only way they were able to survive is basically by songs and by that strong national identity that was entangled with religion. So I think that that is really unfortunate. That's saying religion spoils everything, because that really does. Because you can just imagine what richness and value could be developed without religion there. If people are able, even with all those things that is injected with religious beliefs, if they were not there.
And we all had traditions. I am a mix of English, Welsh, German, and Norwegian. So I remember a few German words my mom said. We used to eat this cheese called Yetost, kind of a dark brown cheese, and we'd slice it and eat it on bread at night. And then I found in Norwegian later on, I asked what it meant. It means goat cheese. Okay. And that's your tradition. And when you do it, it's kind of like a ritual. It just feels like you're a little kid again. Or you eat your favorite dish, or you put on your favorite color, or you do something, or I've got a couple of cases around with memorabilia. I still have my Girl Scout sash with the badges on it. I mean, those things, connect us. They connect us to the past.
And if somebody says, "Oh, you can't have your favorite meal because it was part of a religious ritual," and all of a sudden, even if you make it, that doesn't fit, right? It's something is missing. Your bodies are not here to celebrate with you and stuff like that.
I
So
think
it's really hard.
a culture is also defined by a set of common beliefs, right? Which includes religion. And so if you deviate from that, they're going to ostracize you and say you're not patriotic. If you don't believe this, then you must not believe any of the others, so we don't want you anymore.
Right. Right, but that's exactly how it's done. And then on top of that, you add female aspect of it, and family, and friends, and not working. Over there is probably even worse, right? So all this get amplified.
Exactly. I have a book on my reading pile, One Nation Under God, and it's talking how corporations and evangelical Christian, how did that shape the culture in the last 50 years? And I'm really looking forward to reading that and learning more about it. In Betty Friedan's book, she had the opportunity to meet a corporate consultant on advertising, and he allowed her to look through his work. And he had interviewed hundreds of housewives. And the whole issue in the 50s was get people to buy stuff, get people to buy stuff. And he divided women into 3 groups. One wanted to use the vacuum cleaner the way I've always used it. I'm intimidated. I don't want to try something new. To the woman who might be working outside the home, no, I don't think so. This is good enough. I don't need it. And then there's the woman in the middle, who's a housewife who stays at home, but is looking for different ways of doing things. And one of the things they talked about were the different cleaning products. And I'd never really thought about this before, but instead of having all-purpose cleaner, they would push a cleaner for clothes. They would push a cleaner for the floor. They would push something else to dust with, when one might have done fine. But how do you get people to buy stuff? So it was really fascinating how she took that and fit that into the thesis that she was talking about. Do we want to do one more?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes.
Okay. Ute is one of the, she was born in Germany, and she actually started secular Sunday school here in Portland. Growing up atheist. My story begins in Germany, in elementary school to be exact. I was raised by atheist parents, and my understanding of religion and church was limited to a visit with a friend's daughter who played the organ on Sunday masses. My first true encounter with religious righteousness I had in school, barely 7 years old during PE class. I was in first grade. Part of a newly formed class was 17 other children, and one of my new friends who sat on the bench next to me asked, "Are you Catholic or Protestant?" These were the 2 major religions in Germany. My prompt reply was that in fact I was neither, that my parents did not christen me because they wanted to leave this decision up to me. My friend, in utter shock, announced that I was a heathen, and that heathens go to hell. I had no concept of what a heathen was, nor did I understand what this hell place meant. I don't recall asking my parents about it, but I am sure I did. Religious education was a mandatory subject in Germany, and the only kids excused from it were Turkish kids who grew up Muslim. I joined the Protestant class as my parents felt it was the lesser of 2 evils. And so the next few years I learned about the Bible, discussed Bible stories, learned prayers, and sang religious songs. Back home, religion was not an issue, until at around 13, the question of confirmation came around. This was to be a church event, during which I accepted the Protestant faith and was welcomed into the church. I remember discussing this with my parents, who once again left this decision entirely up to me. They said they were happy to support me in my decision if I truly believed in God and wanted to start going to church. Fine. I had some time to think about this, and I even tried prayer secretly in my room. The part of me that was jealous of my religious friends and their strong belief in a supreme being wanted to believe as well. I wanted to feel held and taken care of. And of course, I really wanted to believe in heaven. I prayed night after night asking for a sign, for anything that would confirm to me that there was indeed a God up there who held his protective hand over me. My prayers remained unanswered. I grew desperate at first and started reasoning with myself why this God who was so good to my friends and who supposedly talked to them would entirely ignore me. I continued to pray into the darkness of my room, but found only emptiness. One night, I simply stopped. My desire to reach a God who didn't answer disappeared. I did not want to go through with confirmation, and I shared this decision with my parents. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come today. Appreciate your comments.
Thanks.